the spirit and feeling for as the last presenter for today. Welcome, Nathalie.
Hi everyone, how are you all doing? Fine, I think. So, my name is Nathalie Nahai and I'm a web psychologist, which I made up because it didn't exist 2 years ago. And basically, what I do is look at how you and me get influenced online to take certain actions, to behave in certain ways. It's about the psychology of online persuasion. I'm actually going to be live tweeting this talk via the fabulous Hootsuite, so you'll get all the links to slides and stuff that you can retweet so that you can get involved in what I'm going to be talking with you about. Okay, so, hang on a sec, let me just make this a little bit bigger. There we go. Okay, my handle, if you want to tweet to me, is at the website. I will reply to all your Twitter comments afterwards, but I'm going to give you a brief introduction as to what I do. We'll then look at Hofstede's dimensions of culture. Who here is familiar with Hofstede's work? Dutch psychologist? Okay, some of us. Cool. We'll then wrap up with some key takeaways and hopefully I'll have a little bit of time for questions and answers. Okay, so an introduction. These are some of the people I've worked with, talked for, spoken to. My background is quite mixed. If any of you have done a quick Google search, you'll know that I have a background in art and music, and also in psychology. I did a BSc in psychology in the UK, and ended up going to art school in London, which I found quite boring, so I went to the States. I recorded 2 albums, performed quite a lot, and it was that way that I got into web design. So I thought, well, I can pay some guy, because it's pretty much almost always guys, at least in London, to design my site for me, and every year I'm going to have to pay thousands, or I can fuck it and learn how to HTML code and do CSS myself, which is what I did. So then I eventually got to the point where I was looking for jobs, couldn't find a job in an agency, and thought, well, how about combining psychology and design, which is what brought me here. So last year I wrote a book called Webs of Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion, and it's based around web psychology, which I define as the empirical study of how our online environments influence our attitudes and our behaviours. So it's about taking research that all these amazing people have done and making it useful. I don't know if you've had to sort of write or sign legal contracts and you read it and it just doesn't make any sense. Yeah, we've all experienced that. Okay, cool. It's basically that. If you've ever tried to read, okay, I know there's some psychologists in the room, but if you've ever tried to read a psych journal, unless you understand what you're looking for, it's impenetrable. So I take research from these various fields and I make them accessible so that we can test the stuff that people are doing, because knowledge is only useful if it can be applied. So ultimately it's about context. It's about a psychological context of your customers as individuals and also within a wider cultural context, which includes things such as personal differences, age, gender, personality, sexuality, all these different elements. But when it boils down to it, to make it really make sense, there were 3 key things that I found that you had to have if you wanted to succeed and be persuasive online. Number 1, know who you're targeting. You guys know this stuff because you are in the business of conversion, so you've already got that covered. So it's about understanding your audience by researching them. Once you have that knowledge, you then communicate persuasively, and that can be through all manner of things. We've already heard loads of different ways to communicate this morning. So things like video, imagery, verbal stuff, copy, actions, even motions that you get people to take. For instance, if you're, who here is right-handed? Stick your right hand up if you're right-handed. Any left-handers? All right, so right-handers, if you're sitting next to someone who's right-handed and you're on their right side, they'll like you more than the person on their left side. It sounds ridiculous, and you can switch this up. If you get someone, if all the right-handers in this audience, I gave you a mitt that made it impossible for you to use your right hand to eat stuff or scratch your nose or pick up a pen, within a couple of hours you'd express a preference for the things on your left hand. So it's just an idea of there are some really weird things that you can do to communicate more persuasively and to endear yourself to people. Just a bit of a random fact. The third one is to sell with integrity. There are loads of persuasion practices that you can use that much of the time will work with many people. There's no silver bullet. But if you're going to apply them and succeed in the long term, you have to do it with transparency and integrity. And the difference between manipulation and persuasion, according to Robin Dreeke, who is the head of the behavioural analysis team at the FBI, who I interviewed for a podcast, he said that the difference between manipulation and persuasion is intent. If you have a good intent for your audience, I want to give the best for my customers, then persuasion principles are for the greater good. So bear that in mind. Okay, so what is culture? Well, these two psychologists defined it as a shared set of values that influence social perceptions, so what we perceive to be good or bad, attitudes, preferences, and responses. So it's kind of the script for how we behave in society. What's interesting online is that there are initially some predictions that we'd move towards a much more homogeneous, standardised web, where English would be the main language, everything would follow a basic Western format. And whilst you do see some of these trends, the fact is that the behaviours of consumers across countries and between regions do tend to be quite variable. So you have to look at culture. If you don't look at culture, you're missing the big picture. So why is it important online? Just a couple of facts. Google Translate, and this I'm sure by now is out of date, I did it about a month ago, has over 1 billion transactions a day. Global internet penetration rates are rising, partly in fact due to smartphones, bringing it to areas where the infrastructure didn't previously exist. So there's a huge uptake, especially in developing markets, of internet access. The reason this is important is because if I were to give every single one of you in this room the same website to use, but in your own language, so the meaning translated, in fact, let me ask you, who's from Sweden? Most of us. Who's from France? England? America? Norway? Denmark? Any countries I haven't mentioned, shout out? Where are you from? Finland. Okay. So mostly Scandinavian countries. But even though you're in the same sort of physical, geographic part of the world, if I gave all of you in this website, in this room, the same website to look at, you would all employ different usage strategies based on your region. So all the people from Norway, all the people in in Sweden, all the people in the UK, in Finland, you'd all use different strategies, which shows that there are subconscious preferences even when you give someone the same website to work with. So if you're a multinational, you need to start thinking about these. And there are specific things that are highly influenceable by culture. Language, obviously, the meaning that we use. We saw earlier there was that Swedish translation, and it didn't really make too much sense. Oh, no, that was in the green room. Okay, so lagrom, just about right. But in English, it's not just about right, it's something more meaningful. That doesn't translate quite right. Body positions. If you go to more open, liberal societies, you tend to find that men and women use much more open gestures. It's all right for me to stand here like this in this country because you're fairly gender fluid. If I was to stand like this somewhere like Saudi Arabia, it would be completely unacceptable. So, body positions are important. Social contexts. Depending on what images you have on your website, what's acceptable to show and what's not. Family images, are they acceptable? What about in this country versus that one? Symbols, national symbols, how patriotic we are. And aesthetics. These change phenomenally across all sorts of cultural groups, not only the large but the small. And these are all important elements that you have to look at. So as far back as 1998, which in internet years is eons, Barbara and Badra said that culturability was a key component of how we respond online. And what they meant was that the relationship between culture and usability is something that we really have to look at if we want to convert more persuasively. So let's dive into Hofstede's dimensions. Hofstede Professor Geert Hofstede has studied psychology for about 40 years in this particular area, and he came out with 6 dimensions, kind of like a personality trait test, but for countries. And he described culture as the collective mental programming of the human mind that distinguishes one group of people from another. He described 6 in total. The final 2 he added a bit later on as his research progressed. Today we've only got time to look at the first 3, but I've also included a link to his website so you can test that later in my Twitter feed. So we've got power distance, individualism versus collectivism, and then masculinity versus femininity, which is a bit of a weird one. Power distance, the first one. This refers to the extent to which less powerful members in society accept and expect unequal power distribution. So an example, in fact I'll show you the slide. An example here, a high power distance country would be somewhere like Saudi Arabia, where you have a huge divide in terms of politics, in terms of wealth. You have very tall hierarchies in politics and structures of education and religious structures, and centralised political power like dictatorships. A very low power distance country, like Austria, is completely different. They tend to value equality. There's a much smaller difference in status and salary and flatter hierarchies. An interesting thing here is that platforms that we use online, such as Twitter, I'll give this as an example, are conceived in flatter hierarchical societies that have lower power distance measures. But what happens when you get a low power distance platform with a flat hierarchy and you transplant it into a high power distance society? The shit hits the fan. Why? Because the people who are young, they're typically young, the early adopters, find out that there is a different societal way to operate. The brain doesn't really distinguish, as we've seen through all these presentations, between online and offline. We express our humanity in the same way. So, if I become used to being able to communicate with you guys one-on-one, and I get used to the fact that I can contact my boyfriend, which I'm not allowed to do in Iran or in Saudi Arabia or whatever, then I start having that expectation offline. And then what happens? My needs aren't getting met. So then what happens? I start sort of demonstrating. I'm not saying that Twitter was responsible, but I am saying that you have to be really careful when you get it wrong, because you can have dramatic impact with these sorts of things. Just to give you an example of where you guys sit, Sweden, in terms of power distance, sits at 31 out of 100, so you're quite low, which is lovely. I like low power distance countries. So an example of how to use this online. I'm going to flick through this fairly quickly, and I'm going to give you an example, and you'll have the slides afterwards. So emphasising order within your website for high power distance. They like structure. Clear hierarchies of content, as in society. Cultural and national symbols work well in terms of instilling a sense of authority. And then you also have the authority figures. And these tend to be people in positions of power. It's not meritocratic, usually. It's something that's been owned, not earned. Official stamps and certifications. We have authorised this. Yes, it's fine. You can go. This is an example of Russian website Aeroflot, and you can see that it's not particularly standardised to Western norms. There's no navigation at the top and sidebar, but they've got some sort of structure, right? Yeah. Okay, so you can see that there's an order on the website of its own accord. They've even numbered, this is sort of one of the subtle signals, they've numbered the sliders. Usually in sort of low power distance countries, they're not numbered, they're dotted. But it's more ambiguous. So even that level of granularity, you start seeing these elements when you know what to look for. You've got a hierarchy of content, national symbols, and authority figures, in this case celebrities, which you find happens all over the world, so that's nothing particularly exceptional. What about low power distance? So for Sweden, you'd be low power distance. What works in this sort of culture? Transparency and disclosure. We've been tweeting all morning. We had Ling kind of hijack from Ling's cars, hijack the Twitter feed earlier. Why? She's from a low power distance, well, the UK is a low power distance country. And so we expect it, and we anticipate it, and it's fine. It also ties into equal access. It doesn't mean that everyone can access everything all the time, but it does mean that you are all equally able to purchase something to gain access. You're not going to be discriminated against based on your hierarchy of social status. Reputation is based on professional merit. Peers and earned media is really important, including trends. We really respond to trends. And we also prefer a more loose structure, the ability to explore for ourselves. This is an example of an Israeli website, Nana 10, and they score very, very low in this dimension. You can see that they've got about 5 layers of navigation at the top. That's a pretty loose structure. I mean, they're showing you where you can go, but they're not indicating really where to go. You also have earned media. Most places online have this. But what's interesting is the content. The content that they showed is merit-based, and it centres on the customer, on the user, and not necessarily, as in the UK, on celebrities and on authority figures. Second dimension, individualism versus collectivism. You'll all be familiar with this. The interesting thing here is that you can find out how individualist and collectivist a culture is, in part, based on the language that they use. And it's figuring out these little cues. So it depends on whether you define your self-image in terms of I or in terms of we. The English language is the only language in the entire world that finds the me so important that we make it capitalised. I, me, mine. It's true. I love you. I'm going to do this for my personal benefit. You don't get that in other cultures, typically. The I is always made small, part of the we, it's on equal footing. Also, for instance, in Spanish, what is it in Spanish? I've totally, ti amo, okay, so in Italian, ti amo is you, I love you, put the other person first. So you can start looking at the ways in which people construct their sentences to see how important I versus we is. High individualistic society, the USA, the American dream, any single person can make it if they just have the grit and determination to succeed. These are loose-knit societies. They tend to value autonomy and freedom and challenge, personal time. They're motivated by external factors. Give me the fastest car. I want to be richer than the Joneses. I want the biggest breast, the most hair on my head. Whatever it is that you're going to get, it tends to be external. So when you're pitching to that kind of audience, give them challenges that will speak to that. Highly collectivist societies like China, very different. The networks tend to be highly social and very cohesive, and business networks tend to emulate blueprint of family networks. So if you have a boss, you'll treat him like family because it's a very important hierarchy to maintain, which in the West is quite unusual for us. Loyalty is highly rewarded, as are physical conditions and also intrinsic rewards. How does this better me as a person? How does this help our community, relationships? Sweden scores at 71, so you're in the upper percentile, similar to the UK. So you're pretty individualistic. In general, obviously some of us are more collectivist than others within personality. And you do have to layer these things together, but that's another story. Okay, so if you're highly individualistic, like Sweden, like the UK, like the USA, you've got to put the emphasis for your customers on personal achievement, motivating their actions. What's in it for me? How can you help me to do these things better? We also tend to like difference and novelty. Stuff that's unexpected, and this is related to the dopamine system in the brain that likes risk and reward. And you get differences in personality, so people who are high risk-taking will be more likely to go for dangerous stuff online. It's like hitting like a drug button, almost. We also prefer competition and challenges, so if you want to boost engagement, use something where people get to compete against one another. Controversial language, if it's appropriate to your business and to your brand, can also be used to great effect. And we tend to favour, much to my chagrin, images just of youth and material symbols of success, which means as soon as you're over 25, you're fucked. But there we go. Okay, so an example of a website that puts this into practice, an American website, and I'm going to run you through a few bits. Excitement. It's a clothing website. How exciting is clothes? Clothes are exciting when you take them off. But that's pretty much the only thing. But no, apparently these are really exciting. So exclusive updates, new arrivals, events, contests and more. You've got all these different elements. Join the party. I'm not going to a party, I'm buying fabric, but apparently it's a party. Competitions. We've got competitions and challenges. You've also got controversial language. Let me ask the ladies here. Would you like it if I came up to you and I said, you're a really nasty girl? No, I would hate it. I'd be like, oh, you're so mean. They love it. They made it the name of their freaking site, nasty girl. So it's controversial. It makes you remember what it is. They favour youth. This girl is probably about 17, maybe 18. And they've highly individualised even the small elements on their website, like the bag, my checkout. Instead of just checkout or basket, my tote. Exciting language again. I don't know if you can read this. It says, soak up summer and give your retinas a thrill. Like, your retina's not going to experience a thrill. It's the brain. And with eye-popping swimwear. I mean, it's really unexpected streaks of colour. I mean, it's really exciting language. Okay, but what about collectivist cultures? You have to engage the community. It's we, not me. You've got to respect moral tenets, traditions and status. And for that to happen really well, I would definitely recommend hiring people on the ground in that country to figure out how to get the meaning of your site across in a way that's culture-specific and culture-sensitive. You have to be really careful with your use of images. I have some friends that live in Israel, and they were telling me that recently, in the last 6 months actually, images of women on billboards are starting to get outlawed because it's seen as morally inappropriate. So you've got to be careful in certain countries how you depict men and women, and if you're allowed to depict women. And it's usually women who get the stick, so you just got to be careful with that kind of stuff. The other element we saw before on the other website, that it was youth and material symbols of success. In collectivist cultures, they tend to favour wisdom and experience of age. And also the security and privacy of personal information. This is a massive issue all over the world, but in places like China, I don't remember do you remember when Google Plus came out? And it was a few years ago, and you couldn't log in anonymously, it had to be your real name. They had serious problems in China because people were trying to log on anonymously or with a pseudonym, and they weren't allowed. And the situation is such that people really need to have that layer of protection, some more than others in China, which is an issue. This is an example of a site. You'll notice that there is not one single image on this site that depicts one single person. The one that's closest, it kind of has clipped a little bit here. It's two chaps carrying a check, but it's still a collectivist set of images. You've also got traditions. Red traditionally is very seen as very positive and lucky in China. I thought I had another slide, I think that's it. Okay, so, and also tend to have national symbols in those sorts of cultures also. Masculinity and femininity. Sweden is really interesting here because you score really low on masculinity over here, and you score a 5, which means you're very high in femininity, which is really cool. And I'll tell you why. Because the interesting thing about feminine societies, and there are not that many feminine societies, is that your gender roles are much more fluid, which essentially means, and I'm biased, that you guys get to choose however you want to live your life, free of gender stereotyping and other stereotypes that we have to submit to in other parts of the world. So in masculine societies, like the UK, which is more masculine, you tend to have strict gender roles, you tend to have an exterior sense of achievement, extrinsic reward, they tend to be quite competitive. Feminine societies, it's more blurred, quality of life is more important, which is why your paternity and maternity care is so good. Tenderness towards others, so it's more about how we're going to have a really good life, which I think is a lovely way to live a life. So, high masculine societies. Japan is a good example. There are distinct roles. Again, we measure success through material rewards, like in individualistic societies, and they favour assertiveness, heroism, which is an interesting one, and achievement. So if you're pitching to someone like that, you might give someone the opportunity to assert themselves and to stand out and to be publicly accredited. In Sweden, it's a little bit different in high feminine societies. The focus is more on relationships, how we connect with one another. Decisions are made by consensus. This only works in countries that are small enough to not have to spend years debating one issue, which is why I don't think it would work in the States, but it seems to work here. Social cohesion is important, as is cooperation and home life. Okay, so high masculine cultures. Make it interacting, exciting, dynamic. Target people so that they feel like they're alive. Be explicit to who you're targeting. Be really, really honest, which means you have to figure out exactly who your user is. You can use gamification and goal-oriented challenges. Motion and video is very acceptable. Also, you tend to find in gender differences, which are more highly expressed in individualistic cultures, these are the kinds of things that men stereotypically tend to favour, and women stereotypically tend to favour others. So it relates to the personal level as well. Limited time competitions and offers are also really useful. So here's the Japanese Coca-Cola website. If you're interested in how they localise their websites, have a look. The other good brand that does this really well is McDonald's. Go figure. So you have dynamic, exciting content. There is stuff blowing up all over the place. Loads of content, loads of colour, loads of sliders, loads of motion. There's a competition at the top. They're explicit about what you can do with Coke. It's very active. On the other hand, feminine societies take a different approach. So showing how you benefit the group, again like the collectivist element. Improving quality of life. Don't project your gender roles, which Americans and Brits tend to do. Collaborate with your customers. People are much more open to giving you feedback because they'll actually be listened to in more feminine societies because you tend to care more. And you can also reflect your audience's aesthetic preferences, also based for that reason. This is an example of, I don't know how you pronounce this, is it Sveriges Radio? It's not at all, is it? It's like completely different, like you're in a Virgin Radio or something. So, okay, ignore my pronunciation. But this is a great website that showcases this really well. Quality of life, the first, how many is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 5 tags that you have up there in comparison to UK-based radio stations. Looks at quality of life. You've got sports, that's a team. You support your team. You've got science and environment, that's wider cultural and social impact. You've got culture, you've got language, you've got children with a little cute thing. You know, you care about your kids. And then on the right, you've got your community front and centre of the website. Brilliant. Okay, I've spoken quite a lot. I realise that was rather quick. I want to wrap up with some key takeaways. So, essentially, if you want to engage and convert a global audience, or even just your local country's audience, never make assumptions. You have to be culture sensitive, which means figuring out what that looks like for your customers, their psychography. Web psychology can provide you with a psychographic context, so not just their age, their gender, etc., but their personality, their desires, what's going to motivate them, what persuasion techniques will be more effective. Different cultures have different usage strategies, so you have to check them out. Try different templates and formats. And gender differences also express themselves in preferences and behaviours in the wider offline world as well. So if you're doing a campaign that's not only online but is offline, like calls, or for instance in Brazil, you buy something online and you expect to pay cash on delivery, that's the culture difference that transcends online to offline. You have to be aware of these. These are all my references, which are fairly many. I don't know if we have time for Q&A, but that's my information. I will make the slides available. They're already available. You can find them there. And I think I should hand over now to the conversionista.
You were speaking so fast that we now had time for questions.
Okay. Not too fast.
That was good. So, any questions for Nathalie? I have a mic here. It's showing green, which means go for somebody. It's a consensus.
It's like he's a psychologist, don't trust her.
There's a collective and consensus oriented. We cannot make a single individualistic move. I'm sorry. That's the way we go. Nobody? Okay, well, there you go.
Hello, my name is Annika. I just want to know, when we have these dimensions that sort of conflict, with Sweden we're very individualistic, but also feminine, which means collective. What happens then?
You end up with weird layers of behaviour. And I think this is where I should probably have put the caveat that I should have injected in the beginning, is that when it comes to psychology, people will want to give you a silver bullet. They don't exist. Don't believe anyone who tells you they exist, because they don't. Ultimately, with psychology, you have to see the principles that you use within a context. So you've got the bell curve distribution. 80% of people roughly will be here. You'll have 10% on each end that are outliers. So you could say for 80% of the time, 80% of this specific population, which is Swedish, they're 18 to 20-year-olds, they're female, and these kind of personalities will respond well to this. So you've got to take things within consideration and then check how they integrate. You can look into the book that he wrote, which is quite big, but it's really worth it. And it's called Software of the Mind, Organisational Cultural. I've tweeted the link to his website, you can find it from there. Or you can tweet to me, I'll send it to you. But that goes into way more depth. Yes, thank you. Any more? Too shy? One more?
What is going for it again? Yeah.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
I was doing usability testing for telephone company, and we tested with different people from different parts of the world that were making phone calls and how they responded to the site. And all of the users just didn't read what was on the site.
Right.
Except from the Indian lady expats.
Indian lady expat?
Yeah, so
okay.
They were here for work. They were reading every single letter on every single page. And they just, killed it on the tests. So I mean, that's very specific cultural difference.
And did you find any differences in terms of gender in the other cultures, or was it were there smaller gender differences where women in other cultures would read, but just not as much as the Indian expats?
Yeah, what I've seen is that women in general don't click on the next button unless they know what is going on the site. Whilst men is just hitting on the next button until they crash.
It's really interesting that you actually saw that in action. There's quite a bit of research for both sides that show different reasons as to why that might be. So, and this is not all women and it's not all men, but women in general tend to be a lot more sceptical of online information. We tend to be more private about what information we give away, and men tend to be a lot happier giving away personal information like phone numbers, real names, etc. Also, men, and it's attributed to higher testosterone levels, which you also get in some women, tend to be more action prone. So if I give you a goal and you're a man and you're high testosterone, you'll go A to B. It's like, kill the buffalo, here we go. Whereas if you say to a woman, right, here's what I want you to do, and you're putting her in a risky environment, i.e. online, she'll be like, right, what are my risks? How do I play this smart? She'll play the game of chess before she gets to hit the button. Whereas the guys are kind of like, bang, shoot, straight to go. But not all women and not all men. Yes?
Do you see any difference in in if the user blame themselves for failing a task, or blaming the system for failing a task?
I haven't looked into that in terms of online, but based on other research with career progression and women in the workplace, I would suspect that women tend to blame themselves more than men. And this is something that you see on applications for job roles. Typically, women will make sure that they've got the list of all the things that they can do. So you can say, this person has to be able to do A, B, C, D, all the way down. And a woman will read that, she'll be like, oh, I'm missing off 2, I'm not going to do it, I'm not going to apply. The man will be like, oh yeah, I can do about 7 or 10 of those 20 things, fuck it, I'll apply, I'll be fine. And so I think there might be that behaviour online, but I don't know for sure, and it'd be an interesting thing to check. Yeah. Good questions. Is that it? Will we... One last one? One last one.
Oh, there's some people over there. I can also, in the pause here, I can tell you that because of sensitive to these consensus-driven societies, Nathalie has chosen to wear red today.
Oh, that was because of this? Yeah. Also, that's my favourite colour. You gave me permission.
And do you have any good examples of global brands that does cultural relevance really well online?
Yes, Coca-Cola and McDonald's do really well. There's a company in the UK that also looks at that specific thing, and they're called Oban Multilingual, and they do culture-specific SEO, and their client list would be a great place for you to look at in terms of, ignoring the really big ones. But I'm told that Coca-Cola actually use teams on the ground to create their websites. I haven't validated that because it's really hard to get that kind of information. But if you check out Oban Multilingual, you'll see all their clients, and you can tweet me and I'll send you the link. But that's a great place to look. Yeah. Is there one last one over there somewhere?
Is there any grey zone between these two groups, like individualists and socialists?
In psychology, the whole thing is a grey zone. It really is. You've got trends and you've got behaviours that you can observe, but there are always exceptions, and you always have other mitigating factors, like the lady here was saying. So, if, for instance, I come from a highly collectivist culture, like China, and it happens to be a situation in which, highly collectivist culture. I know for a fact, because I've done the tests on it, that I'm high in testosterone and dopamine as a female, which means that, according to traditional gender roles, I don't fit, which has caused me problems before in certain countries. So if I live in China, and my personality archetype, neurochemically, is one that goes against the grain and culturally, then I might behave in certain unusual ways online and be part of that 10% that falls outside the distribution. You put me into an individualistic society like this one, or like the UK, which is better suited to my natural type, and I'll probably revert more fully to my natural type. So then you see switches in behaviour. Ultimately, it's highly complex, but the trends are significant enough on a cultural level that you can apply these things and get uplift and track the changes. Yeah, sorry.
Cool. One more here.
What does that last word mean? Are you trying to say something? Oh my gosh! Obviously, my reputation somehow does not match up. So. Anyway, I'm trying to make you blush.
Yeah, one question is: do you know any industrial web page that takes this into account? Not McDonald's and not.
How do you mean industrial? Give me an example.
Business to business, more selling to ABB or more heavy industrial that are good local.
No, the reason I don't is because I actually haven't looked at industrial B2B type stuff. And the caveat to that is because B2B business sort of websites tend not to be as progressive and agile as the startups, both within the organisation and then sort of public facing. So if you find any, please let me know, but I actually haven't looked into that area, so unfortunately I can't answer. But good question. Cool. We good? We're good.
Okay, let's finish up with